Hello and welcome to the World Deciphered, a weekly talk show on national and global security issues brought to you by the Cipher Brief. I'm your host, Suzanne Kelly. At least 11 underground cables have been cut over the past year in the Baltic Sea. Is it intentional sabotage, part of a hybrid war? Last December, Finnish authorities seized a ship that they believe was responsible for severing a subsea power link connecting Estonia to Finland. In the CipherBrief.com this week, we're reporting on Russia's billion-dollar shadow fleet, a large group of ragtag vessels and oil tankers operating outside of international supervision, in part to subvert sanctions on Russian oil. But what else are these vessels up to? You can get the full read on that story at thecipherbrief.com. And as countries like Finland and Sweden manage a response to this shadow of ships operating in the Baltic Sea, the World Deciphered's chief international correspondent, Ia Mermishvili, is talking this week with the former Swedish envoy for hybrid threats, Fredrik Löjdquist, and defense and security policy analyst with Stockholm Free World Forum, Katarina Tracz, about the nature of this new war stirring in the Baltic Sea. The Cipher Brief is covering a number of other fast-developing stories this week as well at thecipherbrief.com, including the meetings that are shaping the end of Russia's war in Ukraine. U.S. President Donald Trump says the U.S. and Russia will begin talks on ending the war after the White House confirmed a 90-minute phone call between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Let's get a quick check now on that and the other stories the Cipher Brief is covering with Cipher Brief Managing Editor Tom Nagorski in New York. Tom?
Hey, Suzanne. We're going to start this week with peace proposals in two very different parts of the world, with the U.S. involved in both of them. First, in Ukraine, the United States is now inserting itself in a very real way in the plans to end the war in Ukraine. President Trump says he has spoken with Vladimir Putin. We don't have a lot of detail on that conversation yet. And that he may soon meet with Ukrainian President Zelensky. Meanwhile, Trump's Ukraine envoy, retired General Keith Kellogg, is headed for the Munich Security Conference, where many key players will be in attendance and the war will be front and center on the agenda. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said this week that Trump would, quote, begin to lay out a broad path forward, unquote, on Ukraine. And on the table, a halt to the fighting, a freezing of the current front lines, security guarantees for Ukraine, although not specified as yet. We don't think NATO membership for Ukraine is going to be part of the equation. Instead, some form of European-led buffer zone is being discussed, with the United States and European aid to Ukraine continuing, and sanctions against Russia staying in place unless Moscow makes concessions. And a new wrinkle has popped up here, Trump saying that he wants American access to Ukraine's trove of rare earth minerals. Then there's that other peace proposal, the one Trump has floated for a U.S. takeover of Gaza. Not clear whether that's a peace proposal, but it's very controversial. Almost no one thinks it's feasible as a plan, although some have argued it may be useful in provoking new thinking on the future of Gaza, which has been ravaged by war and poverty for decades. In the midst of this, that Gaza ceasefire deal, which we've said before is fragile, now looks to be hanging by a thread. And on a very different note this week, a major summit on artificial intelligence was held in Paris. It brought policymakers and tech leaders together to try to chart a course for the future governance of AI. Big picture, this is all about a tug of war between regulation and the race for new models. Vice President J.D. Vance was there warning that Europe's AI regulations risk stifling innovation. On the other side, people warning that privacy issues and overall dangers in place in the unregulated use of AI need further attention. And on our site this week at thecipherbrief.com, we have a look at how the China DeepSeek breakthrough has jolted the race for AI supremacy, another look at the turmoil inside the FBI, and a lot of expert opinion about those comments President Trump has made about Gaza. It's all there at the website. Back to you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Tom. News is happening so fast these days, it can be very difficult to keep up. One easy way to stay ahead of it is by checking out the open source report available to Subscriber Plus members at thecipherbrief.com. If you're not familiar with the report, it's a comprehensive daily readout of what's happening around the world that's impacting global security. Well, anyone who's been following events in the Baltic Sea is likely already tracking the hybrid war that's been brewing there. The Cipher Brief's chief international correspondent, Ia Mermishvili, got insight into how activities in that region are raising alarm with Sweden's former envoy for hybrid threats, Fredrik Löjdquist.
Sweden is very close to Russia and is directly on the path of, at least by some analysis, on the path of Russian shadow fleet, posing different types of threats to Sweden. And I'm talking about island of Gotland, which has become one of the most strategic islands or piece of land for NATO in the north. What can you say about the protection of Gotland, and is there anything in particular that concerns you there?
No, I don't think we're necessarily concerned, for the physical security of Gotland. There has been an awareness of the strategic position of Gotland at least since 2013, 2014, and there's been a lot of attention on that. We are now strengthening our own national defense capabilities on Gotland, but I think there's much more that can be done. Yeah. But of course, now joining NATO is a very, very important step. The reason why Gotland is so strategic is from that you can sort of control a large part of the southern part of the Baltic Sea. And if the Russians were to attack the Baltic states, it would make logical sense for them to take Gotland first and establish a sort of A2AD bubble over. But on the other hand, we don't see, in terms of Russian conventional military forces, it's grind down in Ukraine now, and along the Finnish border. It has to be remembered that Sweden doesn't have a land border to Russia, but we share the Baltic Sea. So we don't see, an immediate conventional military threat to our part of the world, just because the Russians don't have the conventional military capabilities. But as you mentioned, the Baltic Sea is strategically very important. First of all, because the bulk of Russian oil exports now goes through the Baltic Sea. And I think at any given moment, there is a couple of thousand of ships in the Baltic Sea, which is a quite shallow and small sea. And now we have this so-called shadow fleet, which are basically rundown, non-insured ships that come that are flagged in faraway countries and so forth, which much lower security, and even we have seen what is most likely sort of deliberate acts of sabotage, but there's also a huge risk that we have an accident and an oil spill, which would be an ecological catastrophe in the Baltic Sea, and they also have to go through the Danish Straits. Between either the Danish Straits in Denmark or between Öresund, between Sweden and Finland, which are Sweden and Denmark, which are very sort of narrow straits. So it's a very, very sensitive area in that sense.
You're very closely familiar with the Russian tactics and overall goal of this operations. What can you say in that regard? Have you noticed any uptick in the hybrid warfare or operations by Russia? And do you think there is anything that NATO can do in a more active way?
I mean, the whole idea with this is that Russia wants to use the whole spectrum, 360 degrees of their toolbox to inflict, costs or pain or to do us damage. It's an antagonistic toolbox. And the thing with hybrid threats is that you can basically weaponize a lot of things: information space, cyber, migration flows, economic blackmail, illicit financing. I mean, the list is basically endless. The thing is with this is that these activities are coordinated, and they are designed in a way to create confusion, to be hard to attribute. But also to intimidate and create fear. And they are below, that's the definition of hybrid threats or hybrid warfare. They're sort of below the threshold of a conventional military attack, and therefore also below NATO's Article 5. And that means that we need to do three things basically to be able to address these hybrid threats. The first one is really to have a much better situational awareness of the things going on, because they are tricky to discover. It's tricky, is this an accident? Is it a deliberate act of sabotage? It's difficult to attribute, but we have to connect the pieces, or connect the dots, so to say, and that we need to improve. And then, of course, we need to increase our resilience, which has been done a lot over the last decade. But then, thirdly, we need to develop active countermeasures to be able, a toolbox to impose costs on Russia when they are trying to cause harm to us. And this is something called hybrid deterrence. And this is a fairly new discussion, and it's a tricky one because we know how military deterrence works, but we often can't answer sort of quid pro quo in the same fashion and so forth. And this is a discussion that has really picked up speed in Europe, I would say, after last summer. There were reports of attempts to kill the CEO of a leading German defense company, Rheinmetall. There has been all these cables, critical underwater infrastructure that has been attacked. There has been reports on these attempts to put explosives, bombs on airplanes that, thanks God, haven't gone on and so forth. And I think it's a discussion that has been so much intensified over the last 6 months in Europe. And then you can ask yourself, is this because the Russian activities have increased, or if our awareness of it has increased? And I think it's a combination of both. And apart from these three things, you really need to change the mindset, the security culture, because we have to realize that basically anything can be weaponized and we are under attack. And that we have, for such a long time after the end of the Cold War, we have sort of forgotten about this sort of more antagonistic world. And as the Swedish Prime Minister said recently, we're not at war, but we are also not at peace. And this is a new situation now that we will have to adapt to.
The future of national security is here. Introducing the Cipher Brief's NatSec Edge Conference, June 5th through 6th, 2025 in Austin, Texas. Join leaders from intelligence, defense, private industry, and investment as they explore the innovations shaping tomorrow's world. Gain critical insights, connect with top minds, and shape the future of security in an interconnected world. Don't just witness the future, be a part of it. Secure your spot now at natsecedge.com.
I'm Suzanne Kelly. Welcome back to the World Deciphered. Low-intensity operations have increased significantly in the Baltic Sea since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. The World Deciphered's chief international correspondent, Iya Mermishvili, spoke with Katarina Tracz, the defense and security policy analyst with Stockholm's Free World Forum, about what hybrid operations look like from Sweden.
So what we have seen and if we backtrack and look at a larger context, the Baltic Sea for at least the past 10 years, but possibly longer than that, perhaps up to 15 years or even longer now, has seen increased what we call hybrid activities. And these are actions, as you know, that are right below the threshold of war. So low intensity activities that have intensified over the past years and significantly intensified since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So they are often called low intensity warfare, but if you put them all together, it's not really low intensity anymore. What we're seeing now in the Baltic Sea are cable ruptures on, a monthly basis, in the past few months at least, but they are backtracking longer than that, and they sort of fit this pattern of low-intensity warfare or hybrid activities, as they're known as.
And to remind the viewers, we'll have some 11 cables cut in the past, 18 months, and 4 ships have been suspected of participating in some sort of sabotage operation. Who's doing this? We've had information about the Russian ships, about Chinese ships. What do you see? What's your view?
What is typical in these cases, and what is typical for these types of activities, that it's always difficult to state one obvious perpetrator, one obvious culpable. So what we have seen in case of the cable cuts, and you mentioned it's 11 cables. It's at least 6 different occasions, 4 in the Baltic Sea in the past 18 months, but also two occasions in the near Arctic outside of Lofoten, Västerålen. That was the first cable cut in April 2021. And then the second one in January 2022, just outside of Norwegian Svalbard in the high north in the Arctic. In the Baltic Sea, we have seen sometimes Chinese ships. Yipeng Free was the most recent case in Sweden, but also in the incident that occurred in October 2023 that involved cables connecting Finland, Estonia, and Sweden. That was also a Chinese vessel. We cannot say with definite certainty who was behind, who was the instigator of these events, but that's what we know for sure. There have been vessels connected to the Russian shadow fleet, the Eagle S, that was is believed to be responsible for the cable cut in December last year, is connected to the Russian shadow fleet. And this last ship that is involved in the incident that occurred just a few days ago on January 26th is registered on Malta, and we don't know so much more about it yet.
Sweden arrested a Russian ship that's, again, suspected in cutting this latest cable on January 26th. What happens after this? Once the ship is arrested, what's the process? Who's investigating? Is it NATO? Is it Sweden? Walk us through that process. And maybe if you would like to add more context to it, is this the first one that was arrested, or we have other cases and so forth?
So just one detail about this last event. This ship is registered in Malta, and that is about as much as we know about the owners so far. So we can't say with 100% that it's Russian, as you mentioned. There was a process in November last year with a Chinese vessel, Yipeng Free, where the Swedish authorities told the vessel to not leave the Baltic, and it stayed for quite a number of weeks. First, there was a negotiation about boarding or not boarding. In the end, Swedish authorities were allowed to enter to carry out to start an investigation. But the Swedish, I don't know the exact English title here, but the prosecutor general, you would call him, or the state prosecutor, was not allowed to enter the ship, and that, of course, made a significantly hindered the investigation. So it was hard to carry it out fully here. For the last 2 cable cuts, we have seen a lot more decisive action and a lot more forceful action from the beginning. In the Finnish case, the Finnish authorities boarded and escorted the Eagle S ship on December 25th last year for further investigation. And the same thing happened to the now Malta registered ship, but from part of Swedish authorities on January 26th, where the Swedish police task force boarded the ship and escorted it to a Swedish port for investigation. So far, it seems that this becomes a matter of national law enforcement. And it was national law enforcement in the Swedish case that boarded the ship. So it's a police investigation that will continue. But I think that this action of at an early phase meeting and boarding these suspected vessels is key here, and I think that's a key part of future deterrence as well.
Do you see a possibility of escalation in this regard? What can happen? What's the worst case scenario that you worry about?
I think the worst case scenario is that we have seen several spy ships operating in the region that are part of Russia's shadow fleet, but are de facto Russian spy ships, also with armed personnel. There has been a number of those, and there's been journalistic efforts that have sort of called them out and been encountered by men in wearing uniforms and weapons aboard. So the worst thing that can happen, I believe, if in case there was a boarding, that some sort of event would, an unforeseen event would start a chain reaction of other unforeseen events that escalates violence. that would be a real crisis. So that's what I believe is sort of the worst case scenario. Besides that, I think that this is the good way to go about to board them at an early stage using national police and law enforcement as the tool here.
And that's it for this episode of The World Deciphered, brought to you by the Cipher Brief. Just a reminder that you can find nonpartisan, expert-level reporting and opinion pieces, along with a daily open source report that's modeled after the President's Daily Brief to keep you up to speed on events every day in an incredibly fast-paced environment. I do hope you'll check it out at thecipherbrief.com. I'm Suzanne Kelly. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week right here on The World Deciphered.